Have you ever found yourself lying awake at 2 inches the morning, staring at your retirement account balance after another round of recession headlines, doing desperate math in your head? Maybe you're watching colleagues your age get quietly let go during company restructuring and wondering if you're next on the list. Or perhaps you're scrolling through financial planning articles that cheerfully tell you to save more while you're still figuring out why your savings seem to grow so slowly despite decades of trying. The truth is, if you're over 50 and the words economic downturn make your stomach clench, you're not alone in that feeling. Today, I'm going to walk you through the 3 specific money moves every person over 50 needs to make before the next recession arrives. And fair warning, some of this is going to challenge everything you thought you knew about protecting your money. I spend way too much time analyzing personal finance data and trying to figure out why people who've done everything right still feel like they're falling behind. If you're interested in understanding the real financial landscape for people over 50 and maybe getting some honest perspective on your own situation, make sure to subscribe and hit the like button if this information helps you out. Now, before we dive into these 3 critical moves, let me ask you something. When you think about a typical 50-year-old's financial situation, what comes to mind? Do you picture someone who's got it figured out? Substantial savings, solid home equity, maybe a pension or a well-funded 401k, steadily counting down the years until a comfortable retirement? Or do you imagine someone who looks successful on paper but secretly worries that one bad market year or one unexpected layoff could derail everything they've worked for? The truth is, most of us have absolutely no idea what normal actually looks like when it comes to money at 50. We have assumptions based on what we see from neighbors or hear at work, but the reality is often dramatically different from what we imagine. And here's what makes this whole topic so fascinating and frankly a little unsettling. Understanding these numbers isn't just about satisfying your curiosity or making yourself feel better about your situation. It's about recognizing that there's been a massive shift in how Americans approach retirement. And if you're over 50, you've got a front row seat to that transformation whether you wanted one or not. Think about your parents at 50. They probably talked about retirement like it was a given. Work for the same company for 30 years, collect a pension, add some Social Security on top, and that was enough. They didn't lie awake at night wondering if the stock market was going to crash 6 months before they planned to stop working. But if you're 50 or older today, you're navigating a completely different financial reality. You're the generation that watched pensions disappear and get replaced by 401k plans that put all the investment risk squarely on your shoulders. You've seen what happens when markets crash at the wrong moment in someone's career. And here's the part nobody talks about at dinner parties. You've seen recessions before, you remember 2008, but when you were 35 and the market crashed, you had 30 years to recover. At 55, a major recession hits completely different. The data on this is sobering. According to recent studies, workers over 50 take an average of 8.6 months to find new employment after a layoff, compared to about 5 months for younger workers. That's 3.6 extra months of burning through savings, 3.6 extra months of COBRA payments eating into your emergency fund. And many of those workers never find jobs at their previous salary level. We're talking about 20 to 30% reductions in earning power, sometimes more. So let's talk about what you can actually do about it. Your parents at 50 were operating in a completely different financial universe. They had defined benefit pensions that guaranteed a specific monthly payment for life, regardless of what the stock market decided to do. They had Social Security designed to replace a larger percentage of their income. And critically, they had housing costs that consumed maybe 20 to 25% of their income, not the 35 to 40% many Americans face today. But here's what really changed the game for your generation. The shift from pensions to 401k plans didn't just transfer investment responsibility to employees. It transferred all the timing risk. Your parents didn't have to worry about sequence of returns risk because their pension didn't care what the market did in any given year. The company absorbed that volatility. You, on the other hand, are completely exposed. If you're planning to retire at 65 and a major recession hits when you're 60, those 5 years of potential losses and reduced contributions can permanently impact your retirement income. The math is brutal and unforgiving. Consider what financial planners call the retirement red zone, the 5 years before and after your planned retirement date. This is when your portfolio is typically at its largest and most vulnerable. A 30% market decline when you're 35 with a $50,000 portfolio costs you $15,000, which stings but is recoverable over decades of future contributions. That same 30% decline when you're 60 with a $500,000 portfolio costs you $150,000, and you don't have decades to make it back. And then there's the healthcare gap that nobody talks about enough. If you're between 50 and 65, you're in this bizarre financial limbo where you're too young for Medicare but increasingly likely to face health issues that make insurance crucial. The average annual premium for employer-sponsored family coverage now exceeds $23,000, with employees paying roughly $6,500 out of pocket. Lose your job at 57, and suddenly you're facing COBRA payments of nearly $2,000 per month just to maintain coverage, because apparently being unemployed and needing healthcare at the same time is a luxury lifestyle choice. The generational contrast becomes even starker when you look at wealth accumulation windows. Your parents had a clear, predictable path. Work steadily, let the pension accumulate, retire with guaranteed income. Your path involves navigating market volatility, making complex investment decisions, hoping you pick the right funds, and praying that a recession doesn't hit at the worst possible moment. Recent Federal Reserve data shows that the median retirement account balance for Americans aged 55 to 64 is approximately $134,000. Using the traditional 4% withdrawal rule, that $134,000 would generate about $5,360 per year. That's roughly $446 per month. $446 wouldn't cover most people's grocery bills, let alone housing and healthcare. This is why the three money moves we're about to discuss matter so much. The old playbook assumed conditions that no longer exist. So let's start with the first move. The first money move every person over 50 needs to make before the next recession is rebuilding your emergency fund to a level that actually reflects your reality. And I'm warning you right now, the number is going to be higher than what most financial advice suggests. You've probably heard the standard recommendation: keep 3 to 6 months of expenses in an easily accessible savings account. That advice works reasonably well if you're 32 and can find a new job in a few weeks. But if you're over 50, 3 to 6 months isn't a safety net. It's a countdown timer to financial catastrophe. Here's why. Remember that statistic about older workers taking an average of 8.6 months to find new employment? That's the average. Plenty of people over 50 take 12 months or longer, especially if they're looking for positions at their previous salary level. A 6-month emergency fund runs out while you're still sending resumes into what feels like a black hole. The target for people over 50 is 12 to 18 months of essential expenses, not discretionary spending, not your full lifestyle, but the baseline cost of keeping the lights on, the mortgage paid, and health insurance active. For most households, that's somewhere between $4,000 and $8,000 per month, depending on where you live. Let me tell you about Robert. Robert is 54, works as a marketing director at a mid-sized company, and earns $95,000 a year. By most measures, Robert is doing fine. He's been contributing to his 401k for decades, owns his home with about 40% equity, and has what he considers a solid emergency fund of $48,000, roughly 6 months of his household expenses. Robert feels prepared. He's followed the standard advice. But here's Robert's math problem. His essential monthly expenses run about $7,900. His 6-month emergency fund covers him until month 6. According to Department of Labor statistics, his job search at 54 will likely take 9 to 12 months. That means Robert runs out of emergency funds somewhere around month 6, while his job search continues for another 3 to 6 months. At that point, he's either raiding his retirement accounts with early withdrawal penalties and tax consequences, taking on credit card debt at 22% interest, or accepting a position at significantly lower pay just to stop the bleeding. The psychological impact of this cannot be overstated. Robert did everything he was supposed to do. He saved. He built a cushion, and it still wasn't enough because the standard advice doesn't account for the realities of being over 50 inches today's job market. What Robert needed was $95,000 to $142,000 in accessible savings. Yes, that's a massive number. But it's the actual math. Emergency funds are just the foundation. That brings us to the second money move. The second money move is something most financial advisors won't tell you directly, probably because it doesn't generate fees for them. You need to build at least one income stream that doesn't depend on a single employer before you actually need it. Now, before you roll your eyes and assume I'm about to pitch you on some multi-level marketing scheme or tell you to start a dropshipping business, let me be clear. This isn't about side hustle culture. This isn't about working nights and weekends forever. This is about strategic skill monetization. Taking the expertise you've built over 25 or 30 years and creating a pathway to income that exists outside your primary job. The reason this matters so much for people over 50 is simple. If you lose your job at 35, you're a young professional with decades of runway. Companies see potential. If you lose your job at 55, you're an expensive candidate with experience that hiring managers sometimes view as baggage, because apparently knowing how to do your job well becomes a liability after a certain age. Let me tell you about Linda. Linda is 52, spent 25 years in human resources, and earned $87,000 as an HR director at a manufacturing company. She was good at her job. She had certifications, conference presentations, a reputation in her industry. In 2020, Linda's company restructured. Her position was eliminated. It took 14 months to find a new position. During those 14 months, Linda burned through her 6-month emergency fund, dipped into retirement savings for COBRA payments, and watched her retirement timeline shift by years. When she finally landed a role, it came with a 28% pay cut. Her new salary, $62,600. Here's what Linda wishes she'd done before the layoff. She wishes she'd spent the previous 5 years building consulting relationships on the side. Not a full-time business, just a fallback. She had expertise smaller companies needed. Compliance knowledge, policy development, training capabilities. 2 or 3 project-based clients while still employed would have cushioned the fall. The specific pathways depend on your industry. Finance has fractional CFO opportunities and board positions. Technology has consulting and training gigs. Operations and management expertise is needed by smaller companies that can't afford full-time hires. Professional associations and consulting platforms have made this more accessible than ever. The key insight is timing. Building these income streams while employed is dramatically easier than creating them while unemployed and desperate. Clients can smell desperation, and they negotiate accordingly. Recent studies show that only about 40% of workers over 55 who lose jobs ever return to their previous income level. 60% take permanent pay cuts just to get back to work. This isn't about working harder. It's about diversifying income risk the same way you diversify investment risk. But there's one more move that might be the most counterintuitive of all. Here's where it gets really important. And by important, I mean potentially retirement altering. The third money move goes against every instinct you probably have about protecting your money as you get older. It's called strategic risk recalibration, and it's the opposite of what most people do. The common advice you hear everywhere sounds simple. As you get closer to retirement, shift your investments to safer options. Move from stocks to bonds. Reduce volatility. Protect what you've built. On the surface, this makes intuitive sense. But here's the problem with that logic. It assumes you're going to die shortly after retirement. It ignores the mathematical reality that someone retiring at 65 today might need their money to last until age 95 or beyond. That's 30 years of inflation eating away at purchasing power. 30 years of healthcare costs rising faster than general inflation. 30 years of your money needing to work. The data on this is terrifying when you look at what happened in 2008. Workers aged 55 to 64 who panic sold their stock holdings during the crash locked in losses averaging 35 to 45% of their retirement portfolios. That's not the terrifying part. Let me repeat that because it's important. The market recovered within about 4 years. People who stayed invested saw their portfolios return to pre-crash levels and then continue growing. But the people who sold at the bottom, who moved everything to cash because they were scared, missed the recovery entirely. They turned temporary paper losses into permanent real losses. Studies show these panic sellers lost an average of 40% of their potential retirement wealth, not from the crash itself, but from their reaction to it. The bucket strategy addresses this directly. Instead of thinking about your portfolio as one pile of money that needs to be either safe or aggressive, you divide it into 3 buckets based on when you'll need it. Bucket 1 is cash and stable investments covering 2 to 3 years of expenses. This is your immediate needs bucket. If the market crashes tomorrow, you live off this while everything recovers. Bucket 2 is moderately conservative investments covering years 4 through 10, bonds, dividend stocks, balanced funds. Bucket 3 is growth investments for year 11 and beyond. This stays in the stock market because you won't need it for over a decade. By keeping 10 to 15 years of expenses in buckets 1 and 2, you never have to sell growth investments during a downturn. You can wait out any recession because you've got runway. This is what playing it safe actually looks like when retirement might last 30 years. Moving everything to bonds at 55 feels safe, but almost guarantees inflation will erode your purchasing power. Maintaining appropriate stock exposure while building cash reserves is actually the lower risk approach. But understanding this intellectually and actually doing it are two very different things. But wait, it gets more complicated. Because even if you understand these three moves intellectually, there are psychological and systemic barriers that make implementing them genuinely difficult. Let's start with behavioral reality. Loss aversion, the psychological tendency to feel losses more intensely than equivalent gains, is strongest when you have the most to lose. At 30, watching your portfolio drop 25% is theoretically unpleasant but emotionally manageable. You have decades to recover. At 55, watching $400,000 drop to $300,000 triggers a completely different neurological response. Your brain screams at you to do something, to stop the bleeding. And that scream leads people to make exactly the wrong decisions at exactly the wrong times. Then there's the age discrimination problem that everyone knows exists, but nobody discusses openly. According to AARP research, approximately 78% of older workers have seen or experienced age discrimination in the workplace. More damning, studies where identical resumes were submitted with only the applicant's age changed showed candidates over 50 received 40% fewer callbacks than younger applicants with identical qualifications. 40% fewer opportunities just because of a birth date. This has direct financial consequences. When workers over 50 lose their jobs, they're competing against candidates who hiring managers unconsciously view as more trainable, more energetic, more likely to stay long-term, because apparently loyalty is measured by potential future years rather than proven past performance. The data shows older workers who find new positions accept salaries averaging 20 to 25% below their previous compensation. And then there's the healthcare trap. If you're between 50 and 64, you exist in bizarre financial limbo. Too young for Medicare at 65, but increasingly likely to have conditions that make insurance crucial. Average annual healthcare costs for adults 55 to 64 exceed $11,000 per person before any major health events. Lose your job at fees of $1,500 to $2,000 monthly just to maintain coverage. That's $18,000 to $24,000 annually coming directly out of your emergency fund. The healthcare gap alone can burn through months of savings in weeks. Many people over 50 also find themselves trapped by golden handcuffs. Unvested stock options, pension calculations that reward staying until a specific date, deferred compensation that evaporates if you leave early. These mechanisms were designed to encourage loyalty, but they create situations where people feel unable to make necessary changes because the short-term cost feels higher than the long-term risk. The compound effect of all these factors explains why so many people over 50 know they should be making these moves, but keep waiting for a better time, waiting for the market to stabilize, waiting for the right moment, waiting until things feel less uncertain. Every month you delay costs money, even if the cost is invisible. So given all these barriers, what does the math actually look like? According to financial experts, by age 50 you should have approximately 6 times your annual salary saved for retirement. By 60, that number climbs to 8 times. So if you're earning $80,000 at 55, the guidance says you should have somewhere around $560,000 tucked away in retirement accounts. Ready for the reality check? The median retirement savings for Americans aged 55 to 64 is approximately $134,000, not $560,000. Not even close. $134,000. Let me translate what $134,000 actually means in retirement. Using the traditional 4% withdrawal rule, which financial planners use to estimate sustainable annual withdrawals, $134,000 generates about $5,360 per year. Divide by 12 and you get roughly $446 per month. $446 monthly. That wouldn't cover most people's utility bills, let alone housing, food, healthcare, and everything else required to remain alive. It assumes Social Security will handle the rest, which Social Security was never designed to do. It was meant to supplement savings, not serve as the entire foundation for decades of not working. And here's where the gap between financial advice and financial reality becomes almost comical. Every retirement planning article cheerfully tells 50-year-olds to save more, contribute more to your 401k, max out those catch-up contributions, cut expenses. The current catch-up contribution limit allows people over 50 to put an extra $7,500 into their 401k annually on top of the standard $23,000 limit. That's $30,500 per year, which sounds great until you do the math. If you're earning $80,000 annually, maxing out retirement contributions would consume about 38% of your gross income. After taxes, healthcare premiums, and retirement contributions, your take-home pay would barely cover rent in most metropolitan areas. The advice assumes you're not paying for kids' college, not supporting aging parents, not dealing with healthcare costs that multiply every year, and not living in an economy where housing consumes dramatically more income than it did a generation ago. Meanwhile, back in reality, that same person is spending 30% of income on housing, 15% on healthcare and insurance, and trying to figure out how to save anything while occasionally eating food that isn't ramen. Financial planning websites cheerfully suggest 50-year-olds should save $1,500 to $2,000 monthly to catch up. That represents 25 to 30% of take-home pay for median earners. It exists in the same fantasy realm as affordable healthcare and functional pensions. This creates what I call the financial advice paradox. The guidance is technically correct. You do need more saved. But the path from where most people are to where they need to be doesn't fit within actual human budgets. So where does this leave you? So there you have it. The 3 money moves every person over 50 needs to make before the next recession hits. First, rebuild your emergency fund to reflect reality. That means 12 to 18 months of essential expenses, not the standard 3 to 6 months that assumes a job market that doesn't exist for older workers. Second, build at least one income stream that doesn't depend on a single employer. Diversify your income risk the same way you diversify investment risk, because putting all your eggs in one employer's basket at 50 is a bet that the next recession won't target your position. Third, recalibrate your investment risk strategically.